Well, good morning and welcome to this really exciting event. My name's Glyn and I want to start, of course, by acknowledging that I meet you today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who've been the custodians of this land for thousands of years. And I acknowledge and pay respects to elders past and present. And I'm delighted that we're joined today by guests on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people in Canberra, the Widjabul Wabul people in northern New South Wales, the Gadigal people in Sydney, and the Kaurna people in Adelaide, amongst others, and welcome all. Can I welcome everybody to this second event in the Paul Ramsay Foundation's inaugural series, Disrupting Disadvantage. And today we're focused on disruptive data. What role should data play in disrupting disadvantage? What are the trends, but also the concerns worth consideration? And to explore these questions, we have with us the co-founder and the research director of the Governance Lab, which is called GovLab at NYU, New York University, Stefaan Verhulst. Following our keynote address from Stefaan, we'll be joined by a really impressive panel of experts who are each advancing data science and data communication in Australia. As the Paul Ramsay Foundation explores what our own contribution might be to this data landscape, we're drawn toward the innovative, the curious research of our panel speakers, which seek not just to quantify the experience of disadvantage within community, to make sense of it and to test what makes a difference. Throughout this presentation, you're very welcome to put questions up on the Q&A panel. We'll be seeing those toward the end, and we'll have a chance, I hope, to put some of those to Stefaan and to the panel as we go through. But it's my huge pleasure to introduce the co-founder and the Chief Research and Development Officer at GovLab. Before joining GovLab, Stefaan was the Chief of Research at the Markley Foundation, where he continues to serve as the Senior Advisor. He's taught in universities around the world, including the London School of Economics, and he is an emeritus fellow at Oxford University. In his role as co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer at GovLab, Stefaan and his team are really addressing the social contract around data. GovLab's initiatives seek to enhance public understanding and to improve the professional practice of using data, science and technology to address the challenges of our moment. And so in this capacity, Stefaan has advised international governing bodies, including the European Commission and the World Bank. To borrow a phrase that he used, our insights from data are only as good as the questions that we propose. And GovLab's 100 questions methodology in particular is inspiring as we ask in what areas can we locate effective off-ramps to address the cycle of disadvantage. So I hope you'll join me in very warmly welcoming Stefaan Verhulst. Stefaan.
Thanks so much, Glyn, for having me. It's a delight to join you here from New York. And thanks for the very kind introduction. And as you rightly said, I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and our mission is to really look into how do we improve the way we go about making decisions in the public interest, leveraging new tools and new technologies. And one asset, of course, that we are looking into leveraging in order to make decisions more effective, but also legitimate, is, of course, data. And so today, I will try, in a very short period, try to reflect on why it is that data could be and can be disruptive as it relates to decision-making in a positive way. And also, more importantly, I will try to make some provocations on what will be needed moving forward in order to make sure that we accelerate the use of data in a positive, disruptive way. And so if we could start the slide deck, that would be great. And so as mentioned, the focus of my very short keynote, and I don't know whether you can see the slide deck already. Slides are up. Okay, so as I mentioned, what I will reflect on is how can we make sure that data is a disruptive force in the sense of a positive disruptive force in order to disrupt the way we go about disadvantage with other social problems that we might have and improve the way we go about decision making. But before I go there, let me first reflect on why it is that data is a key disruptive force. And if we could go to the first slide, that would be great. Ultimately, what we are talking about is, of course, that data has become the key asset in addition to, for instance, capital and human resources in order to transform the way we go about decisions. And the reason why data has become a key asset is obviously the result of the digital transformation. It's very interesting, anyway, 10 or 20 years ago, I did a lot of work around digital transformation when I was still based at Oxford, but we didn't really anticipate the massive datafication that would take place as a result of digitalizing all the transactions and the services that ultimately we are encountering. And as a result of digital transformation, we see that we are leaving digital trails wherever we go, whether we wake up in the morning and using our iPhone to even use the alarm, to ultimately using, for instance, what I've been doing here, using the city bike to go to the office. We leave a trail wherever we go when there is a digital record being taken. And that means that the volume of data has increased substantially. It also means that the variety of data for which we have access or could have access in order to generate insight is also increasing exponentially. And that ranges from, as I just mentioned, social media trails or mobility trails to ultimately trails that we are leaving by, for instance, going to the grocery store. And so the variety of data has increased exponentially. And if we can aggregate that data, we can generate new kinds of insights. But also the velocity, i.e. we can really now measure behavior in real time. And ultimately the veracity has also changed, in which we now not rely on recorded behavior, but on reported behavior, but ultimately can really tap into recorded behavior. And as a result, have a higher level of veracity with regard to what we see happening in the world. Now, obviously, this has generated massive concerns, but also opportunities. And from my point of view, there are really three elements that always comes back in a discussion about disruptive data. On the one hand is, of course, how do we prevent the misuse of data that is being collected for purposes that might be harmful? But also, secondly, how do we deal with the asymmetries that we have generated as it relates to data, i.e. those that have data and those that don't have data, or even more problematic quite often, those that need data, and especially we are focusing, of course, on the decision makers that need data in order to improve decision making in the public interest, and those that have data. And so we really have to come up with a better way to match demand and supply. And that leads me to the third topic that quite often comes back, and I just set here the stage, and we'll come back to some of those later on, which is really about how do we reuse data that was collected for one purpose for another purpose, and how can we do this in a responsible way? So that's ultimately the basics why we are talking about data, is because we have a lot more data, a lot more variety, and ultimately we also see that we can start using data in new ways. Next slide. But if we are talking about the value of data, then ultimately we are talking about the insight that can be generated from data. Data has no value unless we can generate insight from the data. And when we start talking about disruptive data, then we really have to start understanding what types of insights are we talking about, and what are the types of insights that data can provide. And ultimately, again, in order to set the stage here, we are talking about 4 types of insights that data can provide and where disruption can happen in a positive sense. First one is that disruptive data can transform the way we see reality. And typically, that's when we are talking about descriptive analysis, analysis of the current situation. And if we are using new data sources, or we are aggregating data in new ways, then we ultimately can update the way we are watching and observing reality, quite often in real time, but also from a much larger granularity than we had before. Second type of insight is really about not only seeing and having a better situation analysis, now we can also explain the situation in a much better way. So we have a better way to understand what is actually happening in society. And that typically, of course, is related to a better understanding of cause and effect, so that we are not just, for instance, attacking and addressing symptoms, but now we can also understanding more and more what are actually the root causes that explain the symptom. And so that's the second type of insight that disruptive data can bring. The third one is, of course, that we not only can understand current situation and explain how it is that we got in the current situation, we can also predict what might happen moving forward, which is, of course, predictive analytics that has increased a lot lately as it relates to the data that is made available. And then lastly, we not only can understand and see the situation, we can also assess whether any intervention really makes a difference in a much better way. And so we see, of course, prescriptive analysis and impact assessment increasing. Important is that, of course, we have a hierarchy of insights. And I think it's important to understand that in order to go from situation analysis to cause and effect, we actually do need to have a baseline in order to actually understand what is the cause that generated the baseline, and the same for other types of analytics as well. Just a few examples, and again, there are massive examples, and this is just a poor selection perhaps, but just to give you insight on some of the disruptive insights that we have at our possession now as a result of increases in data, but also as a result of advances in data analytics and the way we can aggregate data and bring it all together in new ways. First example here, for instance, in disruptive description is related with, if we look at the right side, is related with, for instance, nutrition intake in London, where we have managed to use grocery receipts in order to actually map how is actually the food quality and the intake quality spread across London boroughs. And of course, surprise, surprise, there is a clear correlation with economic income. But interesting is that it's not always the case. And I think this was a real interesting wake-up call, a disruptive insight that people automatically assumed that if you're poor, you have poor nutritional intake. But this was a clear indication that that might not always be the case, that there are other variables that we need to start looking into as well. The second slide here, or the second example, is an example here from the US, which clearly shows why the middle class is declining in the US. And I think this was a disruptive kind of chart that showed at a certain point in time, we saw a decoupling of productivity gains and wage gains. And that ultimately explains why we see this massive economic inequality and that is not connected anymore with actually improve in productivity, for instance. And of course, to a large extent, that was a result of both technological advances, but also broader acceptance and adoption of, for instance, shareholder capitalism that explains some of those kind of disruptions that we see in the data as well. Examples, next slide, with regard to diagnostic. And again, I go quickly here, but it just gives you a flavor of what I mean by disruptive insights as a result of disruptive data. The first here, again, on the right side, is from Opportunity Insights from Harvard University, where they clearly have documented that your opportunity in life, whether it's with regard to education, whether it's regard to healthcare, whether it's regard to job opportunities, depends on where you live, right? And that the neighborhood, quite often in which you are born, determines the opportunities that you might have, which is, of course, in a country such as the US, where the assumption is that everyone has equal opportunities, is, of course, a disruptive insight that needs to be taken into account. The other one is from a recent study that also shows interesting cause and effect, where they show the causal effect of heat on violence. And that we see if the heat goes up, we see an increase in violence, but only in those neighborhoods where they cannot afford air conditioning, which happens to be neighborhoods where anyway, people that were already in prison before incarcerated were living. And so we see an increase in recidivism during a warmer period of times, and it's directly related to where you live and whether you actually can afford air conditioning to a large extent, which is an interesting kind of root cause and cause and effect kind of analysis that we now can do by, again, aggregating new data sources and generating new insights. Next slide. Very quickly, we also see, of course, disruptive prediction. This is now well established. One slide on the right here shows that we can actually predict poverty by looking at satellite imagery, where we can distill, for instance, anyway, from a development point of view, where we can distill and extract and predict poverty based upon, for instance, night lights, and also the kinds of roofs that one can witness in certain kinds of neighborhoods. And so this is an interesting disruptive methodology to go beyond existing, quite often, density, population density, and poverty density mapping. And then on the right side, this is just a collection that I just released with some people from Telefonica and GSMA, where we anyway have tried to understand how can we use telecom data to become an early warning system for future pandemics. And if you are interested in that, you can look at Data and Policy, where we have this anyway special edition where we actually show that the using telecom data can indeed predict spikes of pandemics before they might happen as well. And then the last type of insight is really about impact assessment. And here, just two examples. Anyway, there are many more of the advances that we've made in evaluation and evidence-based decision-making. On the right side, you see a new initiative that launched last week, which is called the Policy Impacts Library, where they use a new methodology called marginal value of public funds to assess to what extent certain kinds of policies actually have made an impact vis-a-vis the cost of the intervention, right? And so we see those types of analysis and insights being generated more and more. And then the other example here, again, just to give you a flavor and to set the stage what we mean by disruptive data and insights, is of course an example of, for instance, the What Works Center, where we now have multiple in the UK, in the US, multiple of those centers popping up as a result of advances in data and data science, where we actually can really understand what actually works so that we have better evidence on decision-making and evaluation as well. Now, next slide. What determines this disruptive impact, and how can we accelerate the insights that are disruptive moving forward? Especially because, to a large extent, in order to get disruptive insights and use disruptive data, we really have to become more systematic, sustainable, and responsible in using data. Because that's the real challenge in the current environment. There is no shortage of pilots, and I always anyway make the bad joke is that I've seen more graveyard of pilots than one has hoped to see in one's life with regard to the use and innovative use of data. And so we really need to become more systematic in how we use data to inform decision making, but also more sustainable, because this obviously has a cost. And I think that's where foundations and others have a really important role to come up with new models of actually funding the use of data in a more sustainable and impactful way. But then lastly, also, we need to do it in a more responsible way. And so what I will try to leave behind are a few provocations that I feel needs to be addressed in order to make disruptive data more sustainable, systematic, and also responsible. And the first one is one that Glyn already referred to, is that from my point of view, next slide, disruptive data requires disruptive questions. And as Glyn already said, I've gone public on numerous occasions that the value and the insights from the data are only as good as the questions we are actually posing. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that many start from the data without really reflecting on what are the questions that matter and what are the questions that are important to really pursue with data, as opposed to we have access to data, let's find out what we can do. And so we need, in addition to data science, we need a new science of questions where we actually really reflect on what are the kinds of insights data can provide, and also how do we prioritize which question needs to be answered in order to be disruptive for society as a whole. And so one of the initiatives indeed that Glyn referred to is the 100 Questions Initiative, where we are experimenting with new methodologies in a participatory way to formulate questions that data can answer, but that also helps us to prioritize which ones are worth pursuing vis-a-vis others, so that we actually know that we are on a trajectory for impact. Next slide. We not only need new ways to formulate questions, disruptive data also requires disrupting data silos. At the beginning, I said is that one of the big challenges that we currently have is the creation of massive data supply that is quite often not connected with the demand and those that can use the data for good. And so we really need to find ways to match demand and supply in society in new ways and deal with the data asymmetries that we have see emerging, where you have data monopolies and then we have data poor environments. And so how do we break those silos? And so what we have done is we focused on the creation of new kinds of public-private partnerships around data, which we call data collaboratives. And if you go to that website, you will find the largest repository of examples on how, for instance, private sector has opened up some of their data sets in order to inform public interest decision makings, and also how one can do this in a responsible way moving forward. But of course, it's not only the private sector that needs to open up its data assets, it's also the public sector. And so we also have done a lot of work on open data, open government data, and how do we scale this, especially how do we scale this also at the subnational level, because that's quite often at the local level where the real value can be extracted if one has access to data. Next slide. We not only need better questions, we not only need new ways to tap and access data that can make a difference and be disruptive in a positive way, we also need to disrupt disciplinary silos. Because what we've seen is that quite often, and we saw this also with COVID-19, quite often we have data scientists coming really excited, getting access to data, and then they generate insights that quite often from a domain perspective really doesn't make sense or is really not that interesting. And so we need what we have called, we need to nurture bilinguals, people that have a domain expertise and a data expertise and really are at the forefront of generating new insight, leveraging the new data assets and the new data methodologies that we have at our possession. And we really need to think about bilinguals as the community that we need to tap into and empower in order to leverage data in a disruptive way moving forward. Next slide. Now, of course, the insights are only as impactful as the decisions that they are informing. And what we see is that in the data space, quite often much attention is paid to the first part of the data values chain, i.e. how do we go from data to insight, but much less value or much less attention is paid to how do we go from insight to decisions or from insight to action. And so from my point of view, if we really want data to be disruptive, we also have to disrupt the way we go about making decisions these days. We really have to think about how do we go from data intelligence and turn it into decision intelligence. And we haven't really done a lot of thinking and attention to that. And we need a lot more experimentation in actually making decisions more data-driven. I've put a screenshot there of an initiative that we work with Arizona State University, where they are building decision theaters that are almost like theaters where you actually feed data to multi-stakeholders in order to inform their decisions in a collaborative fashion, right? And I think that's what we need a lot more of, which are new ways of making decisions that are informed by disruptive decisions, by disruptive data. Next slide. Now, what we shouldn't do, and again, going to what Glyn said at the beginning, we shouldn't, of course, use disruptive data to disrupt our social contracts that we have as it relates to data, right? We need to understand how do we get the social license to actually use new data sources and apply new data methodologies. And that will require new deliberations mechanisms in order to really get that social license, because the challenge here is that we are talking about the reuse of data, which typically, right, is data that was collected for one purpose now being used for another purpose. And many consent provisions where you actually asked is for consent for using the data for one purpose don't apply to the secondary use. And so we really need to think about how do we get social license. And here, an example of an initiative that we established in New York City, which is called the Data Assembly, which is a citizens assembly around the reuse of data, where we deliberate with New Yorkers around what they feel comfortable and what their expectations are with regard to the reuse of data in New York City for decision making. Next slide. And I'm almost done. In many ways, quite often we are asking, is this a balancing act, right? Because to a large extent, from my point of view, the current data age is really about preventing two things. On the one hand, preventing misuse, but on the other hand, also preventing misuses of data, right? And quite often this is seen as, anyway, a balancing act. And from my point of view, it's not a balancing act, because we need to figure out how do we prevent misuse of data as we are figuring out how do we prevent misuses of data in order, for instance, to disrupt disadvantage. And that's really what needs, next slide, what requires a new profession, but also new institutions, which we call data stewards. And from my point of view, and this is the last slide, we need to, in order for disruptive data to be constructive, we need to invest really in also new professions and new institutions, which are data stewards. And that's where foundations and nonprofit, but also research organizations can really step up and become the data stewards of the 21st century in order to make sure that data is disruptive, but disruptive in a constructive manner. With that, Glyn, eager to hear how the panel reacts to some of my provocations here, because as I said, my main purpose was to set the panel up to hear what they have to say, and eager to also respond to any questions that the audience might have. Thanks, Glyn, for your patience with me. I might have gone over time a little bit.
On the contrary, Stefan, thank you very much. That was a deeply impressive sprint, and given it's 10 o'clock at night in New York City, thank you for running so hard to get through such a fascinating group of set of insights and content. You gave, at least for me, a new expression, data cemetery. It's not one I've heard before, but it's a fabulous expression. I'm sure it will be coming up often. And you also gave us a slogan right at the start of your talk, which I think has immense value. Data has no value unless we can generate insights. It is really worth remembering. Data for its own sake is of no interest. I think you really captured both the potential excitement of what to do and using satellites to look at roofs to identify poverty is just a fascinating sort of small example in a world of examples to give us a sense of what's possible. But as you suggest, we've got an excellent panel, so let's turn to them so that we can hear their insights, so that people can respond to each other and to you and give you a chance as well. So three outstanding contributors. Deborah Cobb-Clark is Professor of Economics at the University of Sydney. She's a Deputy Director of the ARC Centre for Excellence for Children and Families over the Life course. She's the Program Coordinator for the Gender and Families Research Network at the Institute of Labour Economics in Bonn, Germany. Her research centers on the effects of economic and social policy on intergenerational disadvantage and on the full spectrum of human development. So Deborah, it's a delight to welcome you. Zoe,
thanks, Glyn. Really happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Zoë Condliffe is the CEO and the founder of the Australian crowdsourcing platform She's a Crowd. Lovely title. Informed by Zoe's work in gender and youth advocacy for Plan International Australia, She's a Crowd leverages the power of storytelling to address the gender data gap. Currently, Zoe is also a PhD candidate at Monash University, and her research there examines how sharing online stories of gender-based violence transforms our perception of public space. Zoe, welcome.
Thank you, Glyn.
So good that you could be here. And finally, it's a delight to welcome Dr. Raymond Lovett. He's the program leader for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Head at the Australian National University. Ray is a Nyiyaparra and Wanaban epidemiologist. He's the director of the MyQY, which is the first national study outlining the experience of racism and health outcomes amongst Indigenous Australians. Ray, welcome.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here.
Right, so perhaps, Deborah, if I could start with you. Your research has focused through a lifetime on intergenerational poverty and the various poverty traps that capture people. How important is the sort of insights that we've just heard from Stefaan around how data can be used in this question, and in particular, his call in closing that data needs to speak to action in order to be worthwhile?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Stefaan has said resonates. I certainly wanted to stand up and cheer actually from the sideline. I think that data has been very disruptive in Australia, but that moment was probably 2 decades ago. So when I think about the really disruptive event that I always point to when I talk to students about this, it was the moment that the Department of Social Services made available all of the administrative data on income support records from the Social Security Agency. They had a program where they actually gave academics a small amount of money, invited them in, asked them to write a paper. And that was really the first moment where we began to learn some things. And one of the things that we learned that was really important is that when you put the data together from across a range of programs, the idea that the safety net was simply providing temporary support to people when they fell into bad circumstances and then they would disappear again because life had turned around for them, that turned out not to be accurate. That in fact, once you started linking data in particular ways, what we discovered was that there's a large cross-section of the population that spends a long time on payments. And what they're doing is they're actually moving from one to another. And if you don't have that linked, you don't know that. 2 decades have passed, and now I guess it's fair to say that we're drowning in data, and the issue is one of getting insights out of it. Asking the right questions. What are the priorities? We have a big gap between in principle access and in practice access, and there are just a number of ways I think that it's a good time to think about ways that we could kind of continue to push the envelope.
Great. Deborah, thank you for that. I'd like to turn to Ray on another issue that Stefaan raised, and that's the social license to operate with data, which is hugely important. Ray has reported and spoken very eloquently about, unfortunately, the significant mistrust between, for example, Indigenous communities and data actors. And he's a very strong proponent of Indigenous data sovereignty. So Ray, can you talk to us a bit about how social license works and why this is an important consideration as we think about data as a disruptor?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history in Australia, but also more broadly the Kansas states in particular. So that includes North America and New Zealand. Of data being weaponized against certain populations. Of course, I'm talking about First Nations people. So that was right from the early days in terms of how to extract the resources of First Nations people. And then, for the colonial kind of project, how those resources were then transferred. And there's been an ongoing sort of continuation of that about how to exclude First Nations people from these different opportunities, shall we say, and data again is another one of them, where communities and individuals with expertise around analytics continue to be excluded from data resources, which is why I talk about Indigenous data sovereignty a lot. So there's two components to that, where it's the governance of data. So these are, I hadn't heard that term either, Stefan, around data cemeteries, but it's a good one because I'm sure there's lots of Indigenous data cemeteries that just sit there that are collected on First Nations people and never used. But more broadly, the stuff I'm really interested in is what do First Nations people want? What matters to them? Because there's limited opportunity there as well. If I can, I wanted to go to two of your points around the value equaling insights. And I think it's really important to remember that data is about people. And that when we talk about what insights we are seeking and why Indigenous data sovereignty is important, and I don't think it's important just for, I like your assembly, you've called it a data assembly. But when you're talking about transforming reality, so the descriptive thing, like whose reality are we talking about? Because the people analysing the data, it's usually their reality. And so if you're a minority or from a different background or have a different culture, that data is not going to reflect your reality, which is why this stuff is important for different groups. That then flows down into explaining the situation. So whose situation? So the frame of reference of the person actually analysing those or undertaking those first two steps is extremely important. And that's why the people conducting those two steps need to be people from those realities, because that'll affect the predictive stuff and then whether an intervention makes an impact, because you need to understand how it's making that impact, not just because it's from a particular perspective of someone not from that community or not from that background. But yeah, I think that's why Indigenous data sovereignty, or the data assembly in your instance, is extremely important.
Thank you, Ray. And of course, you've also argued for the strong social contract for data, and quoting John Locke, of course, as the basis of setting up in a sense, a relationship between those who are being surveyed and those who are collecting information.
Well, it's pretty simple. If people feel that there is data about them, what matters to them, that is informed by their views, that explains their situation, the social contract comes. It's when it's taken out of context for that population and used a certain way, and we have lots of instances of that, that you lose your contract, your social contract straight away.
Thank you, Ray. And so if I could turn to you on a related aspect, you're interested in place and the way that racism and violence play out in place, and the way that data can change the relationship because it takes the burden off the individuals to report and allows you to, in a sense, capture patterns. Could you tell us a bit more about this research, and again, drawing on Stefan's observations around the importance of translation to action, what this means?
Yeah, I mean, I think I come from, a startup background. And so in that sense, we are very disruptive. We're trying to disrupt the way things are done. And the way that I came to this was because I noticed that when we can represent data across space, so for example, mapping data, we can really transform the way that decision makers view our reality. And so one example that I like to give is when I was working at Plan International, and I decided that I really wanted to push for this project called Free to Be. It ended up being Australia's first ever crowd mapping platform for women to map street harassment. And it was pre-Me Too. It was, you know, a different time really in 2016. And I was a young woman, and, you know, I was younger than I am now, so early 20s. And I was like, you know, I reckon that women are really going to want to share their stories online and report these experiences, because we know that 9 in 10 women have experienced street harassment. We know that around 90% of sexual assault is never reported to authorities. And, you know, I was trying to push this project through, and so many people said to me, oh, you know, women won't want to share stories online. It's not going to happen, all of this. And I thought, well, I'm a young woman, like I reckon it will, and did some co-design and things. And the project ended up being extremely kind of successful. I mean, heaps of people, hundreds, thousands actually, from in the end all over the world ended up using this platform because we scaled it. And then what I noticed was that decision makers were able to see these data on a map. And previously, a lot of these types of stories have remained anecdotal in our community. I mean, women are traditionally not reported, don't report, or their stories aren't recorded or believed. And this is the same in many minorities. This is even more so in you know, LGBTQIA+ communities and First Nations communities. And so I realized that, you know, I could actually show decision makers all of these stories, and to the women and non-binary people reporting, they were their stories, but on a map they became data. And that was kind of my awakening to the importance of data. And I come from an arts background, so it wasn't really my thing originally, but now I run a data-driven company. And when I started She's the Crowd, I said from the beginning, I want this to be data-driven because data is disruptive. And you'll hear people say things like, you know, data is the new oil. And I think that's interesting because, you know, it really speaks to this idea of data as this untapped kind of resource that we can use for profit. But I wonder, you know, what if we looked at using it for social good? And what if we actually looked at, you know, which data is truly untapped? Like which are the data that are truly just in people's minds, you know, just in people's experiences? And how can we, you know, how can we get that data without re-traumatizing people as well? Because for women who've experienced sexual assault, often the reporting process through the police is more traumatizing than the original experience. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, what we aim to do.
Sorry, thank you. Those are inspiring examples of the use of interaction, which is the sort of focus here. Another question that Stefaan raised is, what if the variables we're looking at aren't the ones that matter? How do we know what matters? And I want to turn to a question from Sally Cripps from the University of Sydney, and then perhaps invite Stefaan to speak to it as well as the panel. And she asks, and I'll read out a slightly long question, to date, predictive models have had a lot of success, but many different models with different factors can lead to the same prediction, and yet the causal inference will be entirely different. For decision makers, it's crucial to know what is the causal relationship rather than just correlation. We risk the claim that data analytics can deliver more than it can. And perhaps, Stefaan, if you'd like to respond, and then I'd like to turn to the rest of the panel as well.
Well, anyway, thanks for the question. That's the ultimate question is, how do we move from correlation to causation, right? And I think because there is a correlation doesn't mean it is a causation, right? And I think that's really where one needs to invest a lot more time and energy to really distill whether the correlation that one notices in the data actually is a causation. Now, it does help, however, to do in advance, and this is something that we are doing more and more, is to actually try to map what are all the issues associated with a particular kind of topic, and what are all the possible variables that are associated with a particular kind of topic in some kind of a topic and systems mapping. If one has that kind of comprehensive systems mapping, then can at least one has a picture of the variety of variables that one needs to be sensitive to. And if then a correlation exists, then can really, anyway, try to to assess whether that correlation is a causation or whether there are other variables that one also needs to test out whether actually that leads to some kind of causal inference. Again, I'm not gonna go too far into detail here, Glyn, but suffice to say that we need, in addition to identifying, and that's how we structure our 100 questions, is that before we go and actually crowdsource, which is a crowdsourcing activity as well, source the questions, we actually do spend a lot of time on trying to map the issues and then source the community on what from all those issues and possible variables, which ones do you believe are worthwhile prioritizing, right? And I think that is one way to actually go beyond the individual researcher, but actually have a broader community reflect on variables that are worthwhile identifying and studying from a causality and correlation point of view.
Thank you for that. I recall from teaching that the favorite way of explaining the difference was to say that in New York, taxi drivers love rain. They're just thrilled when it rains, but you can't argue that they cause rain. Deborah, in your work on poverty, you've had to think about what correlations are also causal. How do we make sense of what we see in the very rich and detailed data we have? Would you like to reflect on that question that Sally has raised?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And in fact, I think about this a lot. And I'm certainly not going to argue that we don't need to understand causation. But I think we have a tendency to kind of jump to that position, particularly with a policy perspective. And I just want to take a moment and sort of reflect on the fact that I would speculate that the vast majority, virtually everything that the policymakers that I talk to, in fact, do is about resource allocation. So for them, prediction and the ability to identify which groups need resources and to anticipate which groups are going to need resources tomorrow is a pretty big part of the job. And in a world where you don't know anything, learning some pretty basic correlations can be really important in helping you understand where you need to be putting your focus. So that's not an argument for not understanding the causality, but I think there's a tendency often for people to be a little bit dismissive of the sort of descriptive correlational evidence. But I do think that if you want to be truly disruptive, at some point we have to get to the causal roots. And it's a very interesting question how you're going to do that, because it's much more resource intensive to do causal analysis. You can't do a randomized controlled trial of absolutely everything. So that makes asking the right questions really, really critical. And it also means that repurposing the existing data, if possible, to do causal analysis is really important. And so thinking about how can we do that? We have this expanding set of administrative data that was collected for one purpose. Is it possible for us to layer randomized control trials on top of that and use the administrative data to perhaps measure outcomes for people?
Okay. Thank you for that. Ray, I'm going to tap your epidemiology expertise, if I may. We're going through the largest real-time experiment in explaining data to the population that we've ever seen. We are watching people struggle with causation and watching them struggle to try and work out what follows from the data that they're being presented. How, as a public health expert, should we be thinking about using data, not just to understand causation, but also to try and explain it to people who aren't necessarily data savvy?
That's a big question. But I tend to agree with pretty much everything that sort of Deborah's outlined. I mean, I'm on the record as saying that we cannot do randomized controlled trials. I've had policymakers in public forums when I've been presenting on family violence, arguing that they need to conduct randomized controlled trials on service provision to women experiencing violence to ensure that safe houses work, for example. And that's sort of adhering to this ultimate line of study design. And randomized control trial, by the way, isn't the gold standard in terms of the hierarchy of evidence. But I do longitudinal cohort studies, and I think there has to be disruption in the analytics space. There's a really good book I'm kind of reading at the moment called The Book of Why, which talks about using observational data, administrative data, and using quasi-experimental methods, which can get you closer to causation. Now, it's not perfect, but we also need to have a revolution in the analytics space and a really decent discussion about these alternative methods. We might not be able to explain unmeasured variables, but we're able to say how much they contribute. If we use some new fancy, there might be debatable methods. The one I'm trying to understand at the moment is front door adjustment and those sorts of things. So we need to have, disruptive methods because a lot of these data that are in these cemeteries are observational and administrative, and we need to be able to build the analytical tools to deal with it.
Thanks, Ray. And as I turn to you, Zoe, if I can share a question from Jane Farmer from Swinburne University, which plays, I think, into this and into the work you do as a data-driven enterprise. Jane notices that in the work she does with NGOs, she's found that data literacy is often lacking and needs to be developed before you can actually get to action. And so we also have a problem, not just correlation and causation, but in the sense we're relying on a set of skills that aren't necessarily widely shared or sufficiently widely shared, and people are trying to frame their actions without necessarily having the background to make sense of the data. You must deal with this all the time, so it'd be great to hear how you explain causation and correlation and how you help the people you work with to sort of come to terms with its implications.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, I don't have a data background, but was, still able to understand that, data is power, basically. And data, you can basically look at which data exists in the world, and it will reflect existing systems of oppression and hegemonies of oppression. And so as soon as I began to understand that, it kind of clicked into place for me. I have a background in sociology, so understanding it through that lens. And also I think that for people that don't have a background in data science, it does sound scary, and it does sound very technical, but I just think of data as stories and as information, and I think of how important it is that we combine lived experience with data, and the fact that lived experience storytelling, can become data. And we try and build a bridge at She's a Crowd between lived experience storytelling and data insights, I should say, really, which is, as we've kind of mentioned, as Stefaan, I think, also mentioned, data insights are the important part, and we certainly find that. So I, of course, have an incredible team of data scientists who work much more technically with our data sets. But I guess that's kind of the framing that I put on it. I'm also very, very passionate about democratizing access to data. And I think that it's interesting. I did a paper a couple of years ago where we looked at every safety app that existed kind of in the world at that time for, women's safety, gendered safety, moving around cities and all of this type of thing. And at She's a Crowd, so and there are heaps of initiatives that look to do this, we really focus on prevention. And that is looking at, the root causes of the issue of gender-based violence. There's heaps of great research that really does identify that causal link, and we really try to follow that. It's much more tempting, especially from a tech startup perspective, to go into making assumptions, band-aid solutions, and reactive or responsive approaches rather than preventative approaches, because it is a complex issue. And so it has been interesting working in the tech startup space, while also trying to work in the prevention space, which is very much focused on those root causes, because it's a long road, and it's really about trying to, what we find is the people in positions of power or decision makers in government are trying to crack this chicken and egg issue they have, where they can't even advocate for or direct resources into the right area or make a business case for prevention for gender-based violence, because they don't have the data insights that they need to do that within their particular kind of circumstance. And so we really try to kind of disrupt that. But back to my study, basically we found that 79% of existing safety apps used a paternalistic approach to addressing the issue. So these were approaches that relied on monitoring women through their phone, through mapping through their phone, automating a call to a security agency. And these were often being abused by perpetrators in their lives. So you can already see here, by not understanding the proper causal link of the issue and seeing it through a gender lens, you can actually cause more harm than good. And then we found that the other 21% were empowering in their approach. So that was much more looking at the idea of agency and the idea of being armed with knowledge. And I think we really need to, I guess, really think about this idea of data as knowledge and as giving us agency. And when we democratize data, we're actually giving people more power to make decisions about their own lives. And something we get at Schizocrat all the time is if you put all this data on a map, won't you make people more scared than they already are? And that's something we're certainly aware of, but we've been able to use our data to design an algorithm that calculates safety route preferences when getting home after dark, for instance. And we believe that that helps to basically allow women to feel a greater sense of agency and empowerment and confidence while moving through their city and looking at, the evidence. We know that perception of safety is a real problem as much as actual incidents. So there's just a whole random kind of selection of examples I've given there. Yeah.
That's
I don't know if I
Thank you.
answered your question.
Thank you for that. Not surprisingly, Stefan's final comments about some of the work he's currently doing in GovLab have attracted lots of questions. Leslie Noble, who's at University of Technology, Sydney, but also a fellow of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, asks, do data collectives working across public and private data require new mechanisms and incentives for collaboration? Stefaan, can you tell us perhaps your view, and this goes to the thing you raised about silos of information as well and how we disrupt those. What does it take to bring that sort of larger data sets together? And then I'd like to get Deborah's views on this as well, because she's done very similar work.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really valuable question, and quite often one that is not understood or explored enough, which is, anyway, what are the incentives for collaboration, right? And how can one really try to understand them in order to then structure a partnership in a way that is, anyway, that has a more sustainable approach, because it actually acknowledges that different parties might have different incentives for being part of a data collaborative. And again, while I'm fully also, of course, a big advocate for democratizing, I think you also need to start thinking about, anyway, what are the incentives for actually providing access, because quite often those incentives are not as aligned. And so we've done a lot of study about incentive structures, both from the public and the private sector. And anyway, we've come up with like 10 reasons why collaboration matters. And I'm not gonna, Glyn, run through all of them, but it ranges from reciprocity, right? So I share something and then I have access to something else. And that something else might be, I share some data and then I have access to actually domain expertise that can make sense of the data that I don't have, right? And that is quite often an incentive for actually data cooperation and data collaboratives. But it also quite often involves, a notion of social responsibility, right? Where you actually, by actually sharing, and I've written about that and given multiple presentations, that from my point of view, sharing data is the corporate social responsibility of the data age, right? And that we really have to start thinking about, if you have data, what is your social responsibility to make sure that the data is informing social impact decisions? And I think that's an emerging trend, and we see across the world this notion of data philanthropy emerging, which is actually a new kind of corporate social responsibility. And that, could be a driver for data collaboratives and data collaboration to happen. But there are other incentives as well. And some of them is actually, to improve the quality of your data, right? The whole, quite often a big advantage of opening up data is to actually have other people look at your data and evaluate what is the quality of your data that you have. And so data quality and improving the veracity of the data is quite often a purpose for data cooperation. And then, of course, coming back to what Zoe said, in some cases, it's actually a rights issue, almost like a collective rights, where you actually set up a cooperative because you feel like there is a right to have access to the data that has been collected about a particular kind of individual. So a whole range of incentives. And I think, Glyn, it's very important to emphasize those incentives. And in some cases, we call this the business case, which doesn't mean it's only for businesses, but it is important to emphasize what's the business case for data collaboration in order for then, for instance, government to invest, private sector to invest, and to do this over time, so that it's not always going back to my one-off kind of examples and all the pilots that we've seen. If there is no strong business case for doing so, it's much harder to sustain it over time as well.
Right. Stefan, thank you for that. Deborah, in your work addressing poverty, you worked hard to bring together multiple sources of data around an aggregate picture using the Hilda survey as your baseline. And I just know from talking to you how difficult sometimes that was, particularly when you're dealing with government data and they want high levels of de-identification so that people can't track individuals and so on, all of which makes sense from the privacy point of view, but makes the task, which is trying to identify flows of poverty, all the more difficult. How do you respond to this question of what sort of incentives can we get to encourage much more collaboration around major holders of data?
Yes, most of my experience is with the Commonwealth government, basically. And so, for them, the incentive is pretty clear, right? Most of them really care about what they're doing and they really want to see, Australia move forward. The issue that you have to grapple with is what are their constraints? And they are extremely constrained, right? They're constrained by finances and politics and constant reorganization. And so for me, I normally like thinking about incentives, being an economist, but on this occasion, I think it's really important to think about constraints. It's absolutely critical, in my view, that you have some notion of a partnership. So Stefaan has called it a collaborative consortium. You can use whatever word you want. But I think that we will really struggle to disrupt things in the way that we would like to without having a partnership approach. The partnership's important for any number of reasons, but I just want to mention two. If you don't have a really close partnership with the decision makers, researchers won't understand what it is that's actually preventing them from acting on the information that they do have. So I once had the experience of sitting in, one of the state treasurer's office, and I was telling him some fabulous research around, why stamp duty was a bad form of taxation. And he interrupted me almost immediately to say, we know all of that. Of course we know that. But here's 10 reasons why we can't actually do anything about that. So our problem is not new information. Our problem is over here. And if you don't have the partnership, you don't know that. The other reason that this is important is you need to align timeframes between when policymaker needs to make a decision, which is yesterday, and the research, which is going to be 2 decades down the road. And sustainability. I really think that's a critical concept that Stefaan has raised. Without the partnership model, we don't have sustainable funding models. We don't have a contractual arrangement that allows for PhD students to be appointed to work in particular areas or to hire international academics. Because without that sort of structure, you're just at the whim of things changing tomorrow. The government changes, departments are reorganized, people come and go, and you just don't ever get a solid footing. So we need to be thinking about ways of developing new and exciting ways of working together that provide some structure so that we can, in fact, begin to understand one another better and also provide some sustainability going forward.
Thank you, Deborah. Appreciate that. And I'd like to come to Ray with a slight variation on the question. Ray, you've been a notable critic of what you've sometimes called open slather data, that is complete public access to material which separates it from the human element of what it is that we're covering. Peter McNamara from ACOS and Mark Reading from Atlassian have asked a variation on the same question, and it's really interesting. And they note that disruptive data is of greatest value when it's a publicly accessible good. We want to ensure that disadvantaged communities are not at the mercy of an algorithm. How do we organise and publicise data so that we give power to the end user? And how do we protect groups that minorities, disadvantaged people living with disadvantage who we want to ensure are not sort of manipulated through this process? And I know you've thought deeply about this.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the result of open slather data here in Australia. There's been one notable instance I can recall, which was shut down pretty quickly. But I think, that concept of open data doesn't specify an absence of governance of data. And I think we have to be very clear about that, in that we can make data accessible in an appropriate manner. And that's usually through really good data governance. And really that goes back to my original kind of comment around advocating for Indigenous data sovereignty. So that's not about Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, First Nations people locking up their data away from the colonisers. It's about reframing what those communities want from the data, and others that may want to analyse these data as well, and whether that fits in the agenda for the population that this work that people want done. So I think talking about open data, we also need to talk about what is good data governance. And that's kind of been part of the conversation that's been lacking, I think. So people will go, well, we should just make everything available because that's easier. But putting in decent governance over data is not that hard either. I mean, we do it in the MyQI study. We've set up a framework that's been guided by Indigenous people, and those people assess whether that data is to be used that way. Government does that now internally. I think there's some problems with it. Deborah's probably highlighted that as well. But a major reform that's coming in Australia, and very few people seem to be aware of it, is the Data Availability and Transparency Bill, which is currently sitting before Parliament in Australia, and that relates to Commonwealth data, which they are trying to open up under an accreditation framework. So as long as there's good governance, and the people that are affected by, the processes around the analysis have a say, and it's, priorities have been determined, and there's no issue with that. Our International Global Indigenous Data Alliance, GIDA, has responded to the FAIR principles, which most people are probably familiar with in the data space, with the CARE principles. So we can have accessible, reusable, data, but we have to apply a set of principles that really look after the people that may be and negatively or so impacted by the reuse of data in particular. So as long as there's good governance,
So there's a really interesting tension though here, isn't there, between good governance, which is since its own virtue, and Stefan's ambition to disrupt our current silos of data and create conversations because data becomes available to groups that otherwise wouldn't have it. And managing that tension must be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we have to do it in research. If we're publicly funded research, we have to make our data available. I'm publicly, I'm one of those people. The data sets I look after fall under that, but they are open and available. It's just that there's a governance process. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And Zoë, you're at the pointy end of this. You're collecting data. You're trying to think about how to empower end users. You're also having to think about the privacy of people. The example you gave of women concerned about safety couldn't be more powerful about how important it is that their privacy is protected and safeguarded. How do you when you bring your entrepreneurial lens to this, how do you think about this question?
Yeah. No, I think what Ray was saying is really interesting, and it just reminded me of these concepts where there is tension between these two concepts, the data ethics and then the data justice. So data ethics really, I guess, locates the issue at the point of the individual or the technical level. So really, can sometimes work to secure existing power. And data justice really tries to look at existing systems of oppression and acknowledge structural power. So I like to think about how to balance both of them in our work. So like in our, I guess, broader goals and our aims and our manifestos and and our values, we think about data justice and we consider ourselves to be data activists who are collecting counter data. And counter data is this really important idea where you look at which data is not currently being collected, and then you go about and collect it. And you can do that, there's many examples from around the world of people already doing that to try and correct a little bit of that power imbalance. And it's a form of data, kind of data activism, and we see ourselves as data feminists as well. And data feminism is really about collecting the counter data, challenging power, being able to imagine a better future, a new world. And I think imagination is really important here as well. And data allows us to do that. If data is if we ask the right questions and then we do the analysis right, and then we present the data, well, we can really imagine a different world. And then the fourth kind of key principle of data feminism is teaching data. And I think that also kind of speaks to the previous question I was asked around, how do we teach data, and how do we teach the right people about this as well? Like the people that, I think at Google, the data scientists at Google, only 10% are women, and Facebook, I think it's 15%. So how do we teach the next generation, and how do we make sure that they're the right people? But then I guess on a more zoomed in level, we of course have extensive data ethics processes, and that includes really clear communication to the people who are sharing and reporting through our website, so that we've got really transparent privacy policies, really clear communication around that. And then all of those technical elements, such as the fact that as soon as you submit your story through us, your name and your email are automatically separated from your story. And then of course, we go through a few different de-identification processes. We have up-to-date privacy impact assessments done all the time, risk management strategies, all of these things, so that we're compliant at a federal government level in everything. And that's really, really important to us. And I've seen so many projects that have launched, oh my God, it hurts me, where they've rushed into making an alternative reporting platform, specifically around sexual assault. And I've been able to scrape the entire data set off the website like that.
Not good.
In 20 minutes, and I'm not even technical. You know what I mean? And so it's it's so important that we put that privacy and security and the data justice, and bring them together and put them at the forefront of what we do.
So thank you very much. We're coming to the close of what's been a fascinating discussion, and Stefan's been enormously generous as it approaches midnight there in New York City in staying with us. And Stefan, you very kindly gave us a set of provocations to start this, a great set of provocations, one that we'll all be thinking about long after this session. I'm wondering, as you hear the conversation, what you would say to us, all of us who are trying to think in Australia about how we use data to better inform public policy, to better inform our analysis, to inform change in our society. What for you are when you think about your work, the priority actions that you look for from others to make a difference?
That's a small question, Glyn, for an end conversation. And first of all, I have to say is that I appreciate all the comments and the observations that Deborah, Ray, and Zoe made, and I can't agree more with all of them. That indeed it's really about anyway, not just opening up, but also about the right governance structure, which is why anyway I always say anyway the real task is to prevention misuse, but also preventing misuses, right? And I think and that's really where we have to become far more sophisticated in not just anyway choosing one or the other, right? Because I think data can be disruptive, but it can also be disruptive in a negative way. And so how do we anyway prevent misuses, but also prevent misuses for indeed those that are traditionally quite often not in the data set or already excluded from actually the decision-making process. And I think that's the real task ahead, and that's where I think we need to become more sophisticated. But I would start again, Glyn, by saying, I feel the more I work around it, the more I really would advocate start with the question, which is also, by the way, principle number one of data governance. Yeah. Explain what the purpose is, right? And also, anyway, coming back to the question about what are the incentives and how do you structure a cooperative, it has to be fit for purpose, right? And I think in order for that, you really need to reflect on what are the kinds of questions, what are the kind of questions that are not posed at the moment, because those that are actually never asked what is the questions are not part of the conversation. So how do we create, and even data literacy, I would advocate, let's have question literacy, right? I mean, reflect on, anyway, what are the questions you have that no one answers for you, right? And why is that so, right? And I think that's really where I would advocate for, is to, in the data conversations, try to not just go to the data and have a conversation about the data, but start with the questions. And that might be, anyway, shifting the balance and also the power balance somewhat in the conversations as such.
Stefan, thank you very much. I'd just like to go through our panel just to give them just a minute to say, what is the priority from here, in particular, as the Paul Ramsay Foundation thinks about how we might help in developing some of the data literacy and availability that has been discussed here. Deborah, what's the priority action for you as you think about what we need?
So I guess I want to say two things. I want to list two priorities. One is this issue about questions, particularly priorities. So we can't do everything. And I'm concerned that we end up doing nothing, or whatever the policymakers' particular flavor of the day is, because we haven't had the appropriate conversation about priorities. It's not just the priorities around the questions, although I think that's important, but it's also priorities around which data sets will we invest in, which things will we match, why will we be putting these things together in particular ways. And I then think that we need to be working harder to resolve the gap between, in principle or in theory access and practical access. So we have, in theory, access to a lot of things which actually have very big practical hurdles in terms of making sense of them. Sometimes it's resource capacity. We don't have the right skill sets. And sometimes it's actually financial, right? In principle, we have access to data, but you have to write a $100,000 grant in order to come up with the access charges. So those would be my two priorities: helping shape conversations around priorities, bringing people in to make sure that we have social license to do the things that we want to do, and then resolving some of these practical hurdles that people have in accessing data.
Deborah, thank you for that. And thank you very much for your participation in this panel. Ray, may I ask you the same question for you? What are the priorities as you think around data futures? Oh, you're muted, I think.
That's right. I think the first priority, am I okay now?
Yes, thank you.
So it's related to the question issue that Stefan raised, but I think to get there, to get to the important questions and the priorities, we have to ask the people what matters to them, what is important to them. Because what matters, particularly in Australia, and of course I'm thinking from an Indigenous, non-Indigenous perspective here, what is important to non-Indigenous people and particularly mostly the policymakers, and what matters to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people down on the ground, are often two very different things. And so for the questions to mean something, you have to ask the people about what matters. I'm a big fan of data literacy as well. And so I think for us as a population, and I'm referring to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here, we need to inform ourselves around the data landscape. And so, I spend a lot of my time working with individuals and communities about data literacy, because if we don't have that fundamental literacy and also about data structures, the data ecosystems, all those sorts of things, then how are we able to access, so getting to Deborah's point, how are we able to engage in the data landscapes? We're, mostly currently excluded from them, but there are, over time there'll be more opportunities. So, we're right into building lots of Indigenous data warriors across the world. And so I think, what matters to people and then building our own capacity to engage in these systems is extremely important.
Right, thank you. And thank you for participating in this discussion today, which is really appreciated. And Zoe, to you, the last word. What are your priorities?
Yeah, I love this data warriors idea. We need data activists, data warriors. I'm an example. I don't have that background, and you see a problem, and I'm using data to try and solve it. For me, I think priority area for me is all about closing data gaps. So obviously I'm focused on gender data gaps, but there are all sorts. And And I think when we talk about insights being only as good as the questions we ask, we also have to think, what are the questions we're not asking? And how are we asking them? Like, you know, we know that there are 4 main barriers for reporting sexual assault and gender-based violence for women. Normalization of the issue, you know, it's just so common. Why would I bother? This internalization, self-blame, like I'll get blamed, you know, it was my fault. Difficulty reporting. So this idea it's an arduous process, probably won't result in anything, and mistrust of authorities. And this is in particular relevant to First Nations communities, migrant communities, communities that have been persecuted by authorities traditionally and historically. And so we are all about trying to remove those barriers to sharing stories, reporting, and kind of in order to try and close that data gap. And that's the first component. And the second is, how do we partner with decision makers in an effective kind of collaborative way to ensure that they can actually use the insights and that they're at the right stage to use the right types of insights to make long-term and preventative change into the future.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for being part of it, part of this process. Best wishes with the PhD. It's going to be a really exciting and important contribution, I think. Thank you to all of our panel. Thank you to those who sent questions, which are really appreciated. A number of you have signed on to stay on after 1 o'clock and join a small panel discussion to work through some of the topics we've heard. And we're going to give you a few minutes break before we do that, just to grab that cup of tea or coffee and be ready to go. And for those who are joining those conversations, the login was available, sent with you during your registration. So you should have the details of how to join the virtual table conversations. So I look forward to seeing everybody at 1 o'clock who's staying on. But for those who are not, for our panelists, thank you. It's been a really, really exciting, interesting, informative time. And Stefaan in particular, all the way from New York, thank you very much for spending this time with us. We've learned a huge amount and we really enjoyed the interaction. So thank you for making it possible and see you all.